Islamic expansion is traditionally understood to have been rapid and unexpected. Within 2 years of the Prophet Muhammad's death, again, I'm going to often include the traditional view that Muhammad lived during these times and this is what happened, because this is how we have to start. We have to pin it back to these traditional points. So, Muhammad's death, 632, within 2 years, they say all of Arabia was conquered. Now, there were battles at that time. There were these civil wars taking place in Saudi Arabia, and moving on up. But the center really doesn't seem to be Arabia. It seems to be further up, or at least not South Arabia. So, Muslims believe that after his death in 632, his successors, the caliphs, continued to aggressively spread Islam by means of the sword. And most Islamic historians will admit it was by the sword, it was by conquering, it was by moving in and taking over those lands. Now today there's the apologetic from the Muslim side saying, oh, it was all defensive jihad. Well, when you see the lands and the takeover of those lands, how can you say that that was defending your land when you're continuing to conquer other lands? It's not consistent. Within 40 years of his death, parts of North Africa, and I'll show you a map of this in a minute, parts of North Africa, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Egypt were included in Islamic territory. Within 100 years, all of North Africa, Spain, and parts of Portugal and Afghanistan were included, extending the empire to the borders of India. It has been calculated by the end of that time, over 50% of lands that had been claimed by Christians in the East were controlled by Islamic forces. Half of Christendom was under the domination of Islam after the first 100 years. Not by defensive jihad, but by offensive jihad. Jihad meaning holy war. And we'll talk about that in a number of weeks, and we'll really focus on that because we need to understand what is implied by jihad. As one scholar explains, the Arabs simply, quote, took possession of whole sections of the crumbling empire of Byzantium. And that is from one of the books you have. Well, actually, Henri Pirenne, who wrote the earlier Muhammad and Charlemagne. But that was his assessment. Now, what were reasons for the expansion? It's a good question. Historians are still debating this. One seems to be the Byzantine and Persian empires were weak after a long war. They had been battling each other. Arabia was kind of in between. They were paying the Arabians to be border guards. And then the Byzantines kind of won over the Persians. It's kind of like what we did with Iraq, I guess. We sort of won, but there's still turmoil. And more turmoil occurred when we pulled out. And that's what happened. The Byzantines pulled out. They left the lands unguarded. And the Arabs saw their opportunity. They were not getting anywhere with their skirmishes. So they took the opportunity, went north, and the lands were wide open. And most of those cities, like Damascus, capitulated and surrendered because of what they had heard. I was reading through Joshua in the battles there, and the people of the land, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, and the Hittites, and all those, they were fearful of the Israelites as they were coming in because they heard of these stories where they had totally wiped out the towns, killed everyone. And of course, when you hear that and you hear this large group of people, a large army coming, you're going to either run for the hills or try to surrender. And so that's probably what happened in the Middle East as these cities were taken down one by one by one. Fear was widespread, rampant, and it was that fear that caused them to capitulate and not fight. Because the Byzantine forces had already retreated back to Constantinople in the north. At first, the conquered people were treated well. In fact, there are Christian sources at that time, written sources that talk of, well, they came in, but it seems these were the Nestorian Christians and the Monophysite Christians, kind of the heretical groups who had been downtrodden by the Orthodox Christians who ruled at that time. They were the Byzantines. But these peripheral groups felt, wow, we have more freedom to worship as we want to worship, and the taxes are not as much, so this is good. But that didn't last very long. And so at first, there was kind of a reprieve. And the Arabs tended to live outside the cities in these garrison towns, so there wasn't the contact even at that time. Islam was seen to be a simpler religion. You only had 5 pillars, 5 things that you need to follow. And we'll talk about those in a couple of weeks. So they saw it as a simpler religion, one that made more sense because you were not asking people to believe that Jesus, who was a man, could also be God. They just saw Jesus as a great prophet, but still a man. And so, and the Trinity didn't make sense. It didn't to many people. And so they thought, well, Islam refutes the Trinity and says it's wrong, and that's simple. That makes it easy. Yeah, one God, it's all we believe in. And so that's why people converted. One of the reasons. And then Muslim warriors, who were pretty smart warriors at that time, they mastered the horseback fighting, and that made for a pretty terrifying force if you were all on foot and they were on horseback. So they instilled fear among the people, so many cities surrendered, as I said. Well, here's an interesting interpretation of that. So a little video that shows the expansion of religion. And so just watch. This goes back to it's their interpretation, but at least it'll talk about how the religions fit in. So it'll give you kind of a perspective. I have a different interpretation, but here you have Hinduism, which did flourish at that time. Then you have the Judaism under Moses, Abraham. So we're coming up to Christianity. Christianity will be in blue. So you have pockets around the Mediterranean, and then it fills in. Buddhism grows, even though Buddha lived 600 years before Christ. Then you have the birth of Muhammad, 570. Islam, Arabia is taken, the Middle East, in a very short time. So within 100 years, you have that much of the land taken in green. And then you have further growth. Here you have the Crusades, the Reconquista, where Christianity makes a comeback. Islam then retakes some of that land or moves away, takes other land. Now you're coming into the, what about the 1800s? And missions really picks up. Watch this, what happens with missions. The blue just spreads throughout. Then you have the Jewish expansion after the war, and then you have a recap right here. Fascinating overview of what happened in the last 4,000 years or so. That's the religion there. Blue being Christianity, green being Islam, then Hinduism, Buddhism. 4 major world religions right there, and their spread. Now, I said I have a little bit different interpretation. This is a chart that I put together and I use in another lecture, Origin of Religions, because I believe that when you go back to, on the left side of this timeline, you're really dealing with the true religion that came all the way through. And so the true religion was also under Abraham, Moses, David, under Judaism. It was contained through that, through the remnant. And then Jesus came, and the focus was there. And that's where Judaism veered off, because they rejected Jesus. So what you see on the top side, the black lines, would represent the degeneration and corruption of these religions. And there are periods of time all the way through where you have that degeneration and corruption. So the real reason that people veered off from the true religion was that they wanted to make their own religion, they wanted to worship their own gods, or worship themselves as gods. And God kept bringing it back. Moses, David, Jesus, then monasticism, and even the Holy Roman Empire, the Reformation, and the modern church. There are these ways of bringing us back to the true religion over the last 4,000 years. Well, actually 4,000 years of documented history, but all the way back to the Garden of Eden, and that would be my interpretation. But we'll talk about that another time, perhaps. It is interesting to note that about every 500 years, God is doing something. Last time he did something, Reformation. Where are we? 500 years later, there's a pattern. Perhaps God is really doing something in the world today. For sure, in the Muslim world, what is he doing? He's disrupted the whole Muslim world. You saw that it was a monolith of green along the 1040 window, the 10 degree to 40 degree latitude window in that whole stretch through the middle. What is he doing? He's disrupting that whole place and sending them out so that they can learn about Christianity. That's one of the opportunities we have. God is doing something, I'm convinced. And one of the later talks that we'll have will be focusing on that. Okay, here is a current map. The red would be over 75%. So North Africa, all through Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, they're all mostly Muslim. In fact, there are about 42 to 52 Muslim-dominated countries in the world out of about 200. So about 25% of the countries in the world are Muslim-dominated, over 75%. And of course, we saw the largest would be the Indonesian area of islands. And then the lighter color would be the from 40% to 75%, 45% to 75%, and that would be through the middle regions here, moving even in India, in certain parts of India, and then other parts 3% on up to 45%. Over 1.6 billion Muslims in the world today. That's 1 out of every 5 people in the world. Now, we don't see that in our streets because we don't have as many in America, of course. About 2%, well, not even that. About estimated 5 to 7 million Muslims in America, concentrated in certain areas, one of those being the East Coast. And as you see here in the expansion, and I pointed out before, you see with the East Coast having the red, that has been one of the targeted areas for the evangelism, because Muslims are very evangelistic. They call it dawah, which is their outreach to others, D-A-W-A. Well, in the number one region of expansion took place in the first 100 years, 630 to 750, and that was through conquest, offensive jihad. The second thrust from 750 to 1500 was in regard to the trade routes or the economic dominance that they had in those regions. People could not get a living unless they submitted to Islam in many of those areas, or they were considered dhimmis if they were Christians or Jews or others, and they were second-class citizens. So the only economic opportunity for them was to convert and be a Muslim. And then you had the migrations from 1500 to present, but mostly in the last 50 years or so, you've had great migrations of Muslims coming out and refugees. You even see that here in Australia. It's a beachhead for Muslims. Into regions, some of China and Russia and the different stans, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and so on. You have a great number of Muslims. Why? What is the attraction of Islam? That's one thing I want you to ask yourself as we go through, because we're going to do a lot of comparisons between Christianity and Islam, and try to figure out what can we say to a Muslim that would allow Christianity to appeal to them. Because they have answers for a lot of things, and they think that their religion is much superior over Christianity, much simpler for one thing. So we'll have to weigh that in to the whole account. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. Again, we'll look at some claims by Muslims and then take that apart and see what history tells us. So the first claim is that Islam began with the Hijrah, this flight of Muhammad out of Mecca to Medina, where he was accepted, and he built his army up, and then within 10 years took Mecca, overran it, became basically the ruler over most of Arabia. But he fled in 622, and that's the official date of Islam, 622. But Hijrah also means emigration. And in 622, historically, after the Byzantines conquered the Persians, they abandoned some of the land back over to the Arabians, who began to emigrate northward into Syria. They had been paid by the Byzantines to be border guards, to be soldiers. Well, the Byzantines were gone, that gold no longer flowed into their coffers, into their pockets, so they had to make other means. Some of them went back to the tradition of raiding the caravans. And that's what you have. Muhammad may have been just a apocalyptic religious leader who was also involved in caravan raids. There's got to be a historical core somewhere, and that's one of the possibilities. Another possibility is that there were several people who were called Muhammad or identified as Muhammad during the 7th century. Another idea is that the term itself, Muhammad, just means chosen one, and as this religion was coming together, as I mentioned, as an intermediate monotheism, they really revered Jesus Christ, and one of the terms that they had for him was the chosen one, Muhammad, Ahmed, praised one, chosen one, the chosen one. So inscribed in the Dome of the Rock in 691, the earliest mention you have of Muhammad by the Muslims, written down, could have referred to Jesus Christ. And Abd al-Malik, the caliph at that time, who my friend John of Damascus worked for, could have been a Christian. That blows everything apart. If the originators of this religion of Islam were originally Christians. In fact, Muawiyah, who became caliph in 661, the first historical caliph we have, I'll say caliph or caliph, both are okay, 661, he has etched in a stone the dedication of a dam down in Saudi Arabia. It has 3 crosses at the beginning. He could have been a Christian as well, and yet he was one of the historic caliphs of that time. So anyway, there are a lot of things that we don't know yet that aren't clarified, but they're becoming clarified through further research and archaeological exploration. Okay, another claim. Number 2, during the first 100 years, Muslims say Islam expanded throughout the Middle East, mostly through peaceful means, such as trade and the merits of Islam itself. So here's another map that shows those thrusts out. They would say the first expansion was under Muhammad, 622 to 632, and all of Arabia was conquered. We don't have historical sources of that exactly, but we do have a lot of battles taking place. The second expansion, North Africa, 632 to 661, under what are called the Rashidun Caliphate, the 4 followers of Muhammad, the honorable caliphs. And then 661 to 750 over in the rest of North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and up into Spain and Portugal, up to 750, the Umayyad Caliphate extending its reach. So within the 100 years, all of this was under control of Islam. Okay, what does history tell us? The early conquest of the Negev, now we're going back to Arabia here, Egypt, you have Iran, Iraq, and North Arabia and into Israel. So you have Negev, Egypt, Palestine, southern Syria were possibly growing raids of immigration of the Arabs. Remember, Hijra means immigration as well. So immigration of the Arabs into those areas due to the pulling out of the Byzantine troops, laying the land wide open, as I said before, and the abandoning of the Federati. These were these paid troops who were no longer receiving tribute for the Byzantine government for guarding the borders. So that's another explanation of what was going on. So I gave you this expansion video, and here I've got just a still picture to show that by 732, Islam had conquered one half of the Christianized world. We need to keep that in mind. That wasn't from just a peaceful movement. That was by forced jihad, forced conversions. They were given three choices. Not quite in the early stages when they were more lenient, because from my perspective, that's when they just had a intermediate monotheism that could not even be called Islam at that time. It was really under Abd al-Malik toward the end of the century, around 700, where you have a lot more going on, as we shall see. But they gave three choices to their conquered people. Convert to Islam or die. For sure, if you were an infidel and you didn't convert and you didn't have you weren't one of the people of the book, Jews and Christians, sometimes Zoroastrians, then you were executed. Many were. But they also realized that if they executed everyone who didn't want to become a Muslim, they wouldn't have any tax base. So they became practical and said, okay, third thing you can do is pay the jizya, the head tax. You pay for your head each year. You want to stay alive, you want your head, you pay this tax, which could be exorbitant. It was not necessarily laid out this percentage or whatever, so it fluctuated. But it was a very onerous tax, so much so that at a certain period of time, the Christians were having to give their sons into away to the Muslims to become soldiers for Islam. They were called the Janissaries. They were very good fighters, but they were Christian boys who were sold because the parents couldn't afford the jizya. So those things happened. Well, 732, they would have continued conquering except for good old Charles Martel, the hammer. And this is a picture of him routing Abdul Rahman al-Gifiki at the Battle of Tours in 732. It is said that if Islam had not been stopped at that place in France, Arabic would have been the language for the scholars in Oxford instead of English. And there's some truth to that because they were moving up very rapidly. But they stopped and they were forced back. But they continued all through the Middle Ages. You had the Muslim forces continuing to beat against the borders, continually. Okay, just to give a picture of the empire growth in a nutshell in one chart, these are the main caliphates. The first one, 632 to 661, was covered by the friends, the followers of Muhammad, who would have lived with him. Abu Bakr, his father-in-law, whose daughter Aisha was 6 when she was married off to Muhammad, and it was consummated, they say, when she was 9. So Abu Bakr for 2 years, then Umar, who did a lot of the battles, then Uthman, who under him the Quran was supposedly collected and written down by 650, and then you have Ali, the son-in-law and cousin of Muhammad, who began the Shias, because when he died, there were the followers of Ali called the Shiat, and they became the Shia. They followed religious leaders. They went their separate way and broke apart. So that's the Rashidun Caliphate, beginning of the Arab Empire. 661 to 750, you had the Umayyad Caliphate, a different family, and they really resided in Damascus. Why so far north? Why didn't they stay in Mecca if this was the center of everything? That's another one of the mysteries. But it's also a telltale marker of what may have really been going on, that these people really started North Arabia, or even, as some say, in Iraq, that area, and then came over instead of up. A lot of question marks when you get into the historical perspective. So they reigned until 750. They were overrun by the Abbasid Caliphate, which centered itself in Baghdad. This was the Persian Empire. So the Persians took over at this point in the Islamic domination. And they ran from a good long time to about 1258 when you had the Mongol horde coming and decimating them. So you had kind of a separation point for a while. And then there were sub-caliphates. You had the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba there in Spain. It was kind of a separate one by distance, for one thing. You had the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, and that was kind of the end of the Arab Empire, 909 to 1171. And the Almohad Caliphate, Morocco, North Africa, and they're the ones who kept going up into Spain. And they were pushed back in the Reconquista around the time of Columbus. When Columbus was sailing the oceans blue, the French and the northern Spanish were fighting back, and they reconquered the land of Spain during that time. What was Columbus doing? He was trying to find another route, right, to the Indies, because the Muslims had cut off all the other land routes, so he was trying to find another one by sea. And then 1362 to 1923, the Ottoman Caliphate, about 600 years. And then after World War I, they were cut off. And Ataturk of Turkey said no more. And he wanted to secularize the country. And now Turkey is going the other way. Turkey was doing pretty well when it secularized. But now under Erdogan and Sharia law, it's going to return back. Okay, then there was the golden age of Islam. This is fascinating. Muslims in traditional histories emphasize that throughout these five empires, great scholars genuinely contributed in the development of philosophy and science. They point to Islamic Spain and the Middle East as the real guiding lights for the development of thought in Europe during the Middle Ages, as well as for essential concepts such as the Arabic numeral system. 1 through 10, they're Arabic numbers, we call them, right? The basic tenets of this view are that the Islamic world, especially during the Golden Age, 750 to 1050 AD, the Abbasid period, was a period of great learning and innovation for Muslim scholars, centered in Baghdad, in Persia. The assumption is that the West at this time experienced a period of cultural and technological stagnation, the Dark Ages, and the Renaissance several hundred years later was only possible because Islamic scholars had preserved the classical works that were later rediscovered by the West and which stimulated the cultural revival of the Renaissance. That's what you're taught in history class today. Was it so? These Muslim advances are said to include the following. Discovery of the astrolabe for navigation. Early version of the scientific method was developed. The development of algebra, algorithms, and spherical trigonometry. The introduction of Arabic numerals, which were originally from India, if you're not aware of that. And the concept of the zero, which is attributed to the Arabs, really came from India as well. So these mathematical basics were from India, from captive cultures. Advances in anatomy, surgery, pharmacology, advances in astronomy, chemistry, and optics. Now, there were good scientists and philosophers at this time. They were centered in Persia. They were Persians. They were recent converts. Many of them had studied under the Greek technology, the Greek educational system. Because you find that within a couple generations of these people that I will reveal to you, within a couple of generations, there was no more innovation because it went back to the stance of Al-Ghazali. It's all just revelation. The Quran is all you need, so focus on that. all this innovation is bid'ah, forbidden. It's not good. Takes you away from the Quran. It has generally been established. It has been generally established from historical records that numerous Muslim scholars contributed to diverse fields of study during this time. So they did do a number of things. So you have in this chart Al-Farabi, Ibn Rushd, it's called by another name. Ibn Sina is Avicenna, and so there you have a picture of Avicenna. These were philosophers who studied and wrote commentaries on Aristotle, which were pretty good at that time. They were said to have revived Greek philosophy to the West. Well, Greek philosophy was still present in Constantinople. The Byzantines were still there. They had all these Greek documents. It was just that the Muslims cut them off from the West so that they could not share their information with them. But the Muslims did have these translated from Greek into Arabic. And, oh boy. Okay, Ibn Haytham is known for optics. Then you have Al-Razi, who's a physician credited with the invention of rubbing alcohol. They had advancements in medicine. Al-Biruni specialized in multiple fields that included astronomy, physics, and mathematics. And you have Al-Khwarizmi, whose name was Latinized to algorithmi, which makes sense. And that's where you get algorithm. And he was said to be the father of algebra because he wrote a textbook that called Al-Jabr, which dealt with formulas and like the quadratic equation. Now, those had been discovered before, but they were kind of just pulling them together, collecting them, and making advancements in them. This was a period of innovation in Persia, but then that was decimated after. Common explanation of the Golden Age is that Islam itself inspired and nurtured a culture where the arts and sciences could flourish. Revisionist scholars who critique the idea of a Golden Age do so on two bases. And I'll finish with this material. It's very interesting. First, that many of the innovations originated from conquered peoples and non-Muslim thinkers rather than Arab scholars. And second, that those Muslims who did contribute to their fields did so outside of and sometimes even directly against the religious circles of Islam. That chart that I showed you on the Muslim scholars, most of them were considered heretics within their own realm. And many of their works were burned, and several of them faced persecution, even death. This was not allowed in Islam, in main Islam. They were doing it because that's what they had been doing for hundreds of years following their predecessors. First of these objections are based on the argument that many or most of the discoveries credited to Islamic culture can actually be traced to the works of conquered peoples, especially Jews and Christians, who were educated in the Western Byzantine tradition of learning and contributed to cultural and scientific development during the first generation or two after the Muslim armies had conquered their lands. And some of the books that I distributed point this out. Okay, some accomplishments by non-Muslims. The architectural design of mosques, especially the domes, which originally from Byzantine models of existing churches. The Dome of the Rock was probably put together by Byzantine Christian architects, and it is there in Jerusalem as a monument to Islam. The astrolabe was developed by the Greeks long before Muhammad was born, though the Muslims had improvements. So they can't claim discovery of the astrolabe, but they can claim improvements. Christians preserved Aristotle's works during the Dark Ages, and Christians such as Hunayn ibn Ishaq, did most of the translation in the Greek and Arabic. The Muslims didn't do the translations. The Christians under them did. 95% of the translations were by the Christians. The first hospital in Baghdad during the Abbasid period was built by a Nestorian Christian. The first Arabic language medical text was written in Greek by a Christian priest and then translated into Arabic by a Jewish doctor. So you have all of this contributing because they were under the domination of Islam. The world's first university may have been the Assyrian Christian school of Nisbis and not Al-Azhar in Cairo, which claims to be the oldest university in the world. The Arabic numerals, as well as the concept of the zero, came from India. They were taken from their captors. The captors took them from the captives. Morera, in the book Andalusian Paradise, the myth of Andalusian Paradise, points out even the Arabic script may have been invented by Christian missionaries from the Christianized Arab city of Hira in ancient Iraq. And Morera also adds that a 10th century Muslim chronicler testified that in Iran the majority of philosophers were still Christian. 10th century. Islam was not the foundation of much significant cultural or scientific development at all, says Robert Spencer. It is undeniable that there was a great cultural and scientific flowering in the Islamic world in the Middle East, in Middle Ages, but there is no indication that any of this flowering actually came as a result of Islam itself. Now that's a pretty bold statement, but history is bearing him out to some degree.